Remember that the temperance movement began back in the Second Great Awakening, as ministers urged their congregations to abstain from using alcohol. They used moral arguments to persuade thousands to pledge to abandon the use of alcohol as a means to deal with the stresses and difficulties of early industrial America. In 1840, a group known as the Washingtonians was founded by 6 alcoholics. They believed that alcoholism was a disease that needed treatment, not a lack of morals. They also believed that by relying on each other and sharing their experiences, they could stay sober. During the Gilded Age, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded by devout Christian women who feared that morals were being undermined by alcohol. They strongly believed in a connection between alcohol and poverty. They used militant tactics to close as many saloons as they could. Finally, the Anti-Saloon League, founded in 1895, was a collection of progressive men and women who worked to pass laws to force people to stop drinking alcohol. By 1916, 23 of 48 states had passed anti-saloon legislation. Many went further, prohibiting the manufacture of alcoholic beverages as well. After the congressional elections that year, dry members, those who favored a national prohibition of alcohol, won a 2/3 majority over wet in U.S. Congress. On January 16, 1919, the necessary number of states ratified the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the manufacturing, transportation, and sale of alcohol within the United States. It would go into effect the following January. Later in 1919, the National Prohibition Act, popularly known as the Volstead Act, after its legislative sponsor, Representative Andrew J. Volstead of Minnesota, was enacted in order to provide the government with the means of enforcing prohibition. Loopholes in this act, such as the fact that liquor was used for medicinal, sacramental, or industrial purposes, remained legal, as did fruit or grape beverages prepared at home, as well as varying degrees of government support throughout the 1920s, hampered the enforcement of prohibition, and it would remain more of an ideal than a reality. Under Prohibition, the illegal manufacture and sale of liquor, known as bootlegging, occurred on a large scale across the United States. In urban areas where the majority of the population opposed Prohibition, enforcement was generally much weaker than it was in rural areas and smaller towns. Perhaps the most dramatic consequence of Prohibition was the effect it had on organized crime. As the production and sale of alcohol went further underground, it began to be controlled by the mafia and other gangs, who transformed themselves into sophisticated criminal enterprises that reaped huge profits from the illicit liquor trade. When it came to its booming bootleg business, the mafia became skilled at bribing police and politicians to look the other way. Chicago's Al Capone emerged as the most notorious example of this phenomenon, earning an estimated $60 million annually from the bootlegging and speakeasy operations he controlled. In addition to bootlegging, gambling and prostitution reached new heights during the 1920s as well. A growing number of Americans came to blame Prohibition for this widespread moral decay and disorder, despite the fact that the legislation had intended to do the opposite, and to condemn it as a dangerous infringement on the freedom of the individual. The effects of Prohibition were as follows. The overall consumption of alcohol declined, while worker productivity increased. Prohibition also contributed to an increased disrespect for the law, an increase in smuggling and bootlegging. Organized crime flourished during the 1920s. Prohibition failed largely due to a lack of federal funding for enforcement and little public support for the law. As you can see in the chart on the top, Prohibition led to an increase in the number of arrests and an increase in the amount of liquor and beer seized by the government. In 1924, President Coolidge signed the Immigration Act, also known as the National Origins Act. This new law, which was the most strict immigration policy ever seen in the U.S., reflected the isolationist desire of Americans after World War I and the spread of racial discrimination in American society aimed at immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. Many Americans saw the enormous influx of unskilled, uneducated immigrants as a cause of unfair competition for jobs and land. According to the law, immigration was open to anyone with a college education or special skills, but denied entry to Mexicans, limited entry for Eastern and Southern Europeans, and the Japanese. It allowed for more immigration from Northern Europe, nations like Britain, Ireland, and Scandinavian countries. A quota was set that limited immigration to 2% of any given nation's residents already in the U.S. as of 1890, a provision designed to maintain the largely Northern European racial composition. An example of the nativist fears and racial discrimination of the 1920s was the story of Sacco and Vanzetti. Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were Italian immigrants who were convicted in a Massachusetts court of committing robbery and murder in 1921. Sacco and Vanzetti were anarchists, believing that social justice would come only through the destruction of governments. In the early 1920s, mainstream America developed a fear of communism and radical politics that resulted in an anti-communist, anti-immigrant hysteria. Liberals protested that the two men were innocent and that they had been accused, convicted, and sentenced to die simply because they were poor Italians and anarchists. After 6 years of appeals and national and international debates over the fairness of their trial, Sacco and Vanzetti were executed in 1927. By 1919, the racial climate had become savage and murderous across the country. In the South, there was a sudden increase in lynching. More than 70 were war veterans. In the North, black factory workers faced layoffs as returning white soldiers took their jobs. Blacks were met with hostility everywhere. In Chicago, a black teenager swimming in Lake Michigan on a hot July day had drifted toward the white beach, whereupon several whites stoned him from the shoreline until the boy drowned. With no one arrested for the crime, blacks stormed into white neighborhoods to retaliate. Whites then stormed into black neighborhoods for payback. There was looting, robbing, beating, shooting, stabbing, and destruction of property for more than a week. Chicago was virtually at war. Another major race riot was in East St. Louis, Illinois in 1917. 9 whites and 50 blacks were dead when all was said and done. During the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan was reborn, dedicated to persecuting minorities and immigrants in American society. By 1924, its membership had grown to over 5 million. Many KKK members were elected to local, state, and federal offices, drawing its support from lower middle-class white Protestants in small cities and towns. The Klan employed various methods for terrorizing and intimidating anyone targeted as un-American. Dressed in white hoods to disguise their identity, Klan members would burn crosses and apply vigilante justice, punishing their victims with whips, tar and feathers, and even the hangman's noose. In its heyday in the early 1920s, the Klan developed strong political influence. In Indiana and Texas, its support became crucial for candidates hoping to win election to state and local offices. At first, the majority of native-born white Americans appeared to tolerate the Klan because it vowed to uphold high standards of Christian morality and drive out bootleggers, gamblers, and adulterers. Beginning in 1923, however, investigative reports in the northern press revealed that fraud and corruption in the KKK were rife. In 1925, the leader of Indiana's Klan, Grand Dragon David Stevenson, was convicted of murder. After that, the Klan's influence and membership declined rapidly. Nevertheless, it continued to exist and remained a force for white supremacy into the 1960s. The Scopes trial, known as the Scopes Monkey Trial, was the 1925 prosecution of science teacher John Scopes for teaching evolution in a Tennessee public school, which a recent bill had made illegal. The trial featured 2 of the best-known orators of the era, William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow, as opposing attorneys. The trial was viewed as an opportunity to challenge the constitutionality of the bill, to publicly advocate for the legitimacy of Darwin's theory of evolution, and to enhance the profile of the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU. Scopes was convicted, but it led to the spread of more school districts teaching evolution in their science classes. The 1920s was a decade of unprecedented prosperity in the U.S. There were a number of factors that led to this economic growth. First, Prohibition gave rise to organized crime, which became big business. The millions made from the sale of illegal booze allowed the gangs to expand to their other illegal activities involving prostitution, gambling, and narcotics. Second, jazz music brought thousands into nightclubs and concert halls to hear famous musicians play their music. These clubs flourished, creating jobs and making lots of money. Next, the use of credit allowed people to buy new technologies that they really could not afford, which led to the rise in debt. The policies of the federal government contributed to economic growth as well. High tariffs meant that Americans would buy American products, which helped American manufacturers. Low income and corporate taxes meant that people could buy more items and corporations could invest more. Advertising expanded as businesses found that consumers' demand for new products could be manipulated by appealing to their desires for status and popularity. Finally, technology fostered growth as well. Electricity in their homes enabled millions of Americans to purchase new consumer appliances of the decade: refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, and washing machines. Automobiles became more affordable and sold by the millions, making the horse and buggy era a thing of the past. Stores increased sales of the new appliances and automobiles by allowing customers to buy on credit. The 29th U.S. President, Warren G. Harding, was elected in a time where many Americans wanted to revert back to the ideals of the Gilded Age. He touted a return to normalcy, with limited government, lower government spending, lower taxes, and higher tariffs to protect American businesses. Unfortunately, Harding's presidency was overshadowed by the criminal activities of some of his cabinet members and other government officials, although he himself was not involved in any wrongdoing. He died suddenly in 1923 of an apparent heart attack and was succeeded by his vice president, Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge, the 30th U.S. president, led the nation through most of the Roaring 20s. Nicknamed Silent Cal for his quiet, steadfast, and frugal nature, Coolidge, a former Republican governor of Massachusetts, cleaned up the rampant corruption of the Harding administration and provided a model of stability and respectability for the American people in an era of fast-paced modernization. He was a pro-business conservative who favored tax cuts and limited government spending. Yet some of his laissez-faire policies also contributed to the economic problems that erupted into the Great Depression. The economic policies of the Republicans in the 1920s were known as trickle-down economics. Trickle-down economics has three main components. Number one, low taxes for the wealthy. Under trickle-down economics, the poor and the middle class paid considerably more taxes than the wealthiest Americans. Number two, there were little or no taxes on corporations. This was also made possible by low government spending. The third element was high tariffs. These high tariffs would protect American businesses from foreign competition. The idea behind trickle-down economics was, if the wealthy paid very little taxes, they would then invest their money in businesses or the stock market, which would create jobs. Wealth would then trickle down to the workers. The wealthy could buy expensive items, putting more money back into the economy and providing more jobs. The side effect of trickle-down economics was a concentration of wealth. Although the nation's total realized income rose from $74.3 billion to $89 billion, it was not distributed evenly. By 1929, the top 0.1% of Americans had a combined income equal to the bottom 42%. In fact, that 0.1% of Americans in 1929 controlled 34% of all savings in the country. 80% of Americans had zero savings at all. The top 1% saw a 75% increase in their income throughout the decade. The other 99% only saw a 9% increase in their disposable income. As you can see in the chart, wages between 1919 and about 1938 didn't change much. They did not reflect the prosperity of the 1920s. Why do you think wages started going up in 1938? Well, this signals the beginning of a lot of war spending by many countries moving towards World War II. When World War I ended, so did farm prosperity. Farmers who had borrowed heavily to expand during the war were now left with a heavy burden of debt. New technologies such as chemical fertilizers and gasoline tractors helped farmers increase their production in the 1920s, but it did not solve their problems. In fact, productivity only served to increase their debts, as growing surpluses produced falling prices. The result being that most farmers were in a depression throughout the whole decade. The net income of American farmers plummeted from $7 billion in 1929 to only $2.5 billion in 1932. This dramatic drop in income was caused by overproduction, falling crop prices, debt due to purchasing more land and equipment during World War I, and foreign competition. Farmers were known as the orphans of prosperity in the 1920s. The chart on the left is the United States Department of Agriculture Yearbook of Agriculture in 1934. Note the decline in prices throughout the 1920s. As a result of this, many farmers lost their farms. The picture in the bottom right is one of thousands of farm foreclosure sales.
The biggest scandal of the Harding presidency was called the Teapot Dome Scandal. Teapot Dome was a place in Wyoming that the government owned. The Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, illegally leased this land to an oil company and pocketed $400,000 for himself in return for allowing them to use the land. He was found guilty of bribery and became the first American to be convicted of a felony while holding a cabinet position.